I need a new workbench. My current workbench was built with recycled materials, and it has this Veritas bench vise on it that's causing the corner of the bench to sag. In all honesty, it just feels janky. So the point is, it's time for a new workbench. I'm the Naked Carpenter, and in this build, we're going to make my version of a Paulk Workbench. Now here's how my workbench is different from the original Paulk and other Paulks you'll see out there. Number 1, instead of sawhorses, it has a mobile base with 5-inch rubber casters and storage for sustainers and other tools. I highly suggest purchasing Ron Paulk's blueprints off his website. They're like $10, and he's got a lot of really good tips in the blueprints for production and assembly of the base. We'll also be using the Kreg pocket hole system. You'll also need some wood glue for the joints. You'll need at least 4 5-inch casters, and you'll need 4 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood, 1 sheet of 3/4 inch MDF, and 2 sheets of 1/2 inch plywood. So let's get started. I bust out my collapsible sawhorses, and since I don't have a Festool track saw just yet, I will utilize what I like to call the poor man's track saw. Here's how that works. You grab a straight edge, some clamps, and you clamp that straight edge to the workpiece. There's a catch here though. To do it properly, you always need to add 1.5 inches to whatever measurement is of what you're trying to cut. Now here's why. Most circular saws, from the edge of the outside of the table to the inside of the saw kerf, measures exactly 1.5 inches. The first sheet of 3/4 inch plywood will be breaking down into 4 cross-cut sections, which will then be cut in half and will be our tool storage dividers for the base of the bench. Once those are cross-cut, you will rip a cut on a second sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. This long rip cut will serve as the spine of the tool storage area, dividing one long side of the storage from the other. Once you've processed your sheet goods, you'll move on to building the 2x4 crib support system, which will be screwed to the bottom of the mobile bench. The reason for this is to prevent the workbench and the base from sagging once it's loaded with tools. Grab your 2x4s, measure out 5 sections, set up a stop block on your miter saw station for accuracy, and get cutting. Next, mark 24-inch layouts on your 2x4s, grab a nailer, and put that crib together. I personally use a nailer, and I had some 3-inch ring shank galvies laying around, so I used those, but using screws here is perfectly fine. Once the crib is built, place it on the sawhorses, and you'll grab a fresh sheet of plywood. Once that's on top, screw that puppy down. Once that's done, it's time to set up the Kreg jig. I recommend hooking a dust extractor or a vacuum up to the Kreg jig using their nifty little vacuum attachment, as you'll save a lot of headache and cleanup. Make sure your Kreg jig bit itself is set to 3/4 inch and get to drilling every 6 to 8 inches. Once all your Kreg screws are drilled, and there's a lot of them, it's important to install the 4 casters, as it'll be much easier now than when it's fully put together. Once you flip the top, mark each of the 4 holes with a drill bit, move the casters, and drill the 4 holes. I have some leftover roofing screws that'll do for now, but I recommend carriage bolts if available. Now, flip it over and we'll attach the sides. I start with the outside sheets and then I work my way inward. It's important to apply glue to the edges and areas that are being screwed. Apply a generous bead of glue all along the joint. Then flip the outside edge up, and Kreg has this nifty 90-degree edge clamp that you can use. You'll notice that once the joint is glued that there's a lot of squeeze out. Don't worry though, just grab a water-soaked rag and use it to wipe the squeeze out on each side of the joint. Once that's done, rinse and repeat on the other side. I then move on to screwing in the spine of the tool storage area. And from there I line up my tool storage dividers and screw them in. A number of these storage areas will be for sustainers, so I cut 16-inch story sticks on my miter saw, and I use those in each cavity to screw each divider so I don't have to use my tape every time. Once the spine and dividers are screwed, I throw my next piece of 3/4 inch maple on the top, and once it's flush and square, I glue each edge and screw it down. Once everything is screwed together, I take it off the sawhorses and check to see if the storage area will hold by laying on it, because I'm really fat. Time to start building the Paulk Workbench. I grab a sheet of 1/2 inch maple plywood, put it on this tool storage cart, and I rip it down the middle so it's easy to rip on the table saw. I then open my garage doors because my shop is really small, and I start ripping the 1/2 inch maple plywood into 7-inch strips. Once I've ripped all the strips for the bench, I use a piece of 3/4 inch MDF and I start on making my template for the elongated holes that are all throughout the Paulk Workbench. For this, I use a 4 3/8 Milwaukee hole saw. For me, drilling holes with a hole saw and scraping the dust off the workpiece is this really oddly satisfying process. Once the holes are cut, I grab my Festool jigsaw and I cut out the horizontal lines of the template. Once it's cut, I use sandpaper and a block to sand out any imperfections in the MDF. MDF is really easy to work with and I love it in this regard for this. I then move outside, bring my strips out, and clamp my MDF template to my first strip. The first strip I will use to cut the 4 holes with the template, and then I will use that strip as a template for the rest of the long strips. Once my flush trim bit was trash, I decided to put my Festool Carvex with a 6-inch blade to the test. So I cut the remaining strips down on my miter saw, clamped the 6 strips together, put 2 screws on each side through it, scribed my template, drilled a hole with a 4-turn bit for my Carvex, and I got to cutting. I've gotta say here, I love my Carvex, and it never ceases to amaze me with its accuracy and its awesome cuts. I mean, this thing sliced through 6 sheets of maple ply like it was butter. Butter. I then moved a sheet of 3/4 inch MDF onto the tool storage and started to assemble the guts of the Paulk. I started with the outside long edges by gluing them, clamping them on one side, and then started to screw away. After wiping off the excess glue, I used a drywall square to mark the perpendicular pieces of the Paulk bench. I do this so I can see where to lay my glue lines down. I then glue the short outside edge of the workbench and screw that edge down. Once the excess glue is cleaned off, I move into gluing and setting the shorter perpendicular strips. I glue the spine next of the Paulk Workbench, and then glue and screw the opposite short outside piece, and move on to gluing the next short pieces. Once the shorter pieces are on, I turn my attention to the last exterior long strip to glue and to screw on. Once it's glued and screwed on, I add the last piece of 1/2-inch maple ply, make sure it's flush and square, and screw it down. I then flip the workbench over safely, and I do that employing the awesome help of my wife. It's time to move to the final stage of the build, drilling the 20mm holes on the top of the bench. The goal here is for the holes to be 20mm with 96mm centers and to be as accurate as the CNC'd holes on the Festool MFT bench. To accomplish this, I'll be using a jig I purchased called the Parf Guide drilling system designed by Peter Parfit of the New Brit Workshop in England. The system is pretty simple. You start by using the 2 rulers provided that have CNC'd holes in them. You drill the holes, insert a pin into those certain points, and then you use the 3-4-5 method to create 9/16 holes at 96mm centers all over the bench. After that's done, you use the jig to bore out the 20mm holes all over the bench. When that's done, I'm able to utilize the holes in the bench with the Parf dogs. I start by putting the tall Parf dogs down first, then the small Parf dogs. I then grab a piece to cut, place it against the small Parf dogs, grab my Festool track fence, and there you have it, a perfect 90-degree cut. Although I wasn't pleased with some of the quality of my cuts on the Paulk Workbench, the bench itself is dead flat, and the Parf holes are incredibly accurate. If you like what you see, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.